Hi, and welcome to episode 22 of Talent Acquisition Trends and Strategy. Today, we are joined by Seth Welty. Seth, welcome to the show.
Thanks, James. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here. And before we jump into some of the topics that we outlined, would you mind telling everybody a little bit about yourself and what you're up to right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a little bit about my background. I've been in the industry for about 20 years now. I started off my career primarily in talent acquisition in investment banking, rose through the ranks through there, but eventually figured out that I was never going to make it to managing director. So I decided to become an entrepreneur of my own. Started an AI recruiting company, made the typical rookie mistake of having a business partner who had the same skills that I did. So that didn't go as far as we wanted it to, but it gave me a lot of experience as being an entrepreneur and the pains and process of that. But then most recently, I was in venture capital for 4 years, primarily working with entrepreneurs, helping them really grow their businesses after they've received funding. So that was a huge learning experience. And then most recently, I transitioned to the Burns Brothers, primarily to help them build the firm. So really kind of that concept of doing a bunch of consulting work for 4 years. And then now I actually want to do it for myself. So really exciting firm, which is basically a multicultural marketing agency and consulting firm. And we are on a mission to create a more inclusive world. So one of the topics that I'm super passionate about is diversity and inclusion, along with helping entrepreneurs and others build really great places to work. So hopefully kind of improving people's lives.
I love it. Well, thank you. Thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself. And I'm really excited to dive into all these topics. I think just to start us off, I want to touch on like a topic for startup founders and maybe earlier growth stage organizations. When you get that funding check, right? Whether and I guess it depends what funding round we're talking about here. There's going to be obviously different strategies depending on where they are in their growth phase, but how do you think
Absolutely.
about like talent strategy, right? Like putting together the right scale strategy to build a world-class team and organization. So founders get that check. Like what's the first step? How do they go thinking about developing a business and talent strategy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the most exciting moment in an entrepreneur's career is when they get that first Series A check. It's a significant amount of money. Their dreams are coming true. They have a ton of things that they want to spend the money on. But you have to get them to pause and think about, try to be strategic about their approach. So in order to get funding, the entrepreneurs had gone through, a whole host of hurdles in order to create a really appealing business strategy. So really, when I work with an entrepreneur, it's all about taking that business strategy and turning it into a talent plan. So that process is kind of the talent planning process. And it's really looking at what your business objectives are against the talent that you currently have in-house, identifying the gaps, identifying the opportunities to promote people and create opportunity. And then also to identify those gaps, think about, is this a consulting position? Is this a full-time position? Is this something that's not core to our business and we should be outsourcing it? And then once you get to that point, you're able to really identify who you need to recruit. And then ultimately you kind of plot that across a calendar, right? Who do we need to recruit in the next 3 months is really what you want to focus immediately on. So just kind of, and then that can also be integrated into an entrepreneur's kind of typical quarterly business routines. So when they go into that quarterly business strategy discussion, the leadership team, then once they know how to do talent planning, that should augment that meeting so that every quarter they're thinking about talent and thinking about who they need to hire next in order to
Gotcha.
really get that growth.
What do you think? Like, let's just talk about like what are the most common holes that founders fall into, right? Like, what are the biggest mistakes or most common mistakes that you see when it comes to this process?
So first of all, not doing the process, so not
Right.
being planful is really a huge mistake, because you do kind of get that high of having resources that you've never had before, and you start making decisions quickly because you want to get that product out, you want to go to market, you want to get, your next beta test out, like whatever your kind of hot button business side focus is where you start spending money, and then you start hiring people. So I think the first problem is that people don't migrate from your friends and family hiring strategy. So when you're in seed, when you're in seed round, you're typically hiring people that you know, that are in your network, who are talented individuals, but just you may be just kind of bringing them in because you trust them and you know they have a ton of potential. Once you move into Series A funding, you want to start expanding out and actually kind of activating multiple channels so that you have a kind of a diverse candidate slate, from a skill set and experience perspective, and that you're hiring people for kind of long term. So I think that's kind of the mind shift. I would say that's probably the first challenge from an external, from the VC's perspective, is saying, hey, we got to have a bit of a mind shift here. Is, we're not going to continue hiring all of your friends and family. You really need to start thinking about bringing professionals in that are specialized in the areas that you have gaps in. And you should go through a recruiting process. Obviously, people should be part of that candidate slate, but you should be interviewing other people who might be better suited for this particular role in this particular time.
Chances are your friends and family are not going to be the best fit individuals to scale a wildly successful product company,
Exactly.
or services company. I mean, like, I'm not like, I think when it works, it's more like, okay, you worked with these individuals at a prior startup, right? And so the work product they can produce. That's different. I mean, that even if they're like friendships, like that's okay. But if that's not the case, then I typically recommend just avoiding that, right? Because it's just going to create all sorts of issues. That can,
Absolutely.
and the founding days are special, right? If you mess those up, it's really hard to get back on track. So to the extent you can, I think companies, people can avoid that, and at least, if they're going to hire people, they know it should be people that they've worked with or that they can kind of back channel or go through, whether it be investors or the board or advisors or mentors. Try to go through their network, and so you can kind of verify that an individual is the right fit.
Yeah.
And you do that as much as you can, but then you're right, like as you scale, it's not like, okay, you can't go hire 100 engineers with that strategy. You can hire like your first team of 5, right?
Exactly.
But there's a point where it's like, okay, we got to start thinking about a proactive talent strategy, not just be reactive. Like, oh, like we need to hire somebody yesterday. Can we make that happen? Can we
Right.
hire them in the next week?
Exactly.
Right? It
And
changes.
you also want to introduce people with different experiences, right? So if you used to work at Google, you don't want to hire everyone in your Series A from Google. You want to hire people that have had diverse experiences, people who have technical experiences, people who have industry experience, like people who have functional experiences from different companies, from different universities. That's the way that you bring a team together that will be able to truly innovate. Because if you have groupthink, you'll squelch any ability to be innovative moving forward.
I could not agree with you more, man. That is spot on. I think the other aspect too, just like the Google example, like another way thinking about enterprise, I have nothing to get, like, it's great when you have founders that, were product people at Uber or, big tech, right? Well-known companies or
Mhm.
something like that. But also it's really good to have people that have startup experience because it's just a totally different point of impact usually, right?
Yep,
Like you're
absolutely.
like on the enterprise side, you're very, particularly at a Google or like an Adobe or something like that. I mean, you're so siloed within a very specific function so many times. Like
Right.
maybe if you can find somebody that was working on a very specific smaller project within a larger org, that could work. But sometimes it's going to be kind of like a pretty big shock moving to a startup culture and environment. And so, for instance, like for sales hires, I always recommend make sure your first couple salespeople, they've worked for startups before. Like
Right.
don't get the person from Salesforce, because like you have, chances are they're going to go in, they're used to having like a whole sales enablement, sales operations team, their own
Yeah.
SDRs, sales engineers, like an entire infrastructure based, like built around them to for that help them to be successful. And then it's like you're thrown into a startup and it's just kind of like figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen that kind of early stage executive that was hired from a big company who comes in and just basically fails because they just are not used to doing the work. Like there's this kind of expectation of there'll be someone around them to do the heavy lifting, and kind of that's not the case. So one of the things that when we start thinking about kind of what values that you want, or values and principles that you want to recruit for, I always recommend that you include entrepreneurial spirit. So there's people who are very entrepreneurial that work for big companies, and then there's people who do not. So if that person does not, if you're hiring somebody from a large organization and they are not displaying entrepreneurial spirit and grit, then they're not going to be successful. And there's ways to really kind of create an interview process that can help you ensure that you're getting those values, and without being dogmatic about it, right? Like it's a total generalization to say we're only hiring people from startups, we're only hiring people from kind of big four consulting firms. Like those are kind of recruiting techniques that people fall into that you don't want to do. But it doesn't mean that somebody uniquely could be qualified who works in the innovation center of Bain, right? Like there's so many different variations of people's career. So I try to kind of not tell people not to do things, but I want them to look at the candidate holistically and really, really kind of dive into to figure out if they could actually be successful in an entrepreneurial environment.
Yeah, that's definitely a more sophisticated way to do it. I think with some of the startups we've worked with in the past, and for whatever reason, sales seems to be the hardest to transition from enterprise to startup. Like I just see a lot of failed attempts there. So
But I
sometimes, I
think
mean, I'll be honest.
salespeople, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I'll be honest. Like a lot of times, I'll just recommend to the founders. I'm like, look, I'm not saying you couldn't build the right process and interviewing structure and everything to optimize your chance, but the reality is like there is a greater percentage chance of failure hiring from enterprise for this specific position. So why take that risk? And what you're, but again, the way that you're doing it is, I mean, that's the right way. It's just, do we trust the companies to really do it the right way? And it's,
That's why they hire you, and you integrate that into your RPO and
right.
say, look, we're gonna create a multifaceted interview process, right? And it's gonna include, a diverse interview panel. It's gonna include a case study. It's gonna include whiteboarding sessions for your executives, so that we really get under the hood of these individuals' capabilities. Because when you're in a hurry and you just need to get bodies in place, it's so easy to make mistakes. And I think in my career, the biggest mistakes I've made in recruiting are primarily in the sales department, right?
Yeah.
And recruiting, because salespeople and recruiters are really good at selling themselves, and they're very personable. And I live and breathe this world. So like I have affinity bias for these individuals. And then they get there and you're like, oh man, they just like sold me a bag of goods. And then you're like, shit, now I have to manage this person out.
Right. So I have a quick question about that. So
Uh-huh.
when you were part of we're full-time focusing on VC, right?
Mhm.
Um, how often did you try to staff up the founding team with connections, like people you could back channel, people that knew other people and other leaders in your network, versus doing the more sophisticated, multifaceted interviewing process and setting that up the right way? I mean, like, did you always, for the founding team, try to, okay, we want the first 10 employees to be known quantities, or would you recommend implementing this process, this talent process from day one?
Right. So on the VC side, we try to get into the conversation early and often. So as we were evaluating them as organizations that potentially invest in, we had conversations about their recruiting strategy, their kind of leadership strategy, like who they want to surround themselves with, to get a sense of like who the early adopters are and who are not. Many times they've already done some of the work and have decided that these are the people that they want to bring in. And as a new relationship with an entrepreneur, you're not gonna stand in the way of that unless it's completely egregious, like the salary is completely off and the person's totally not qualified. But I would say is once we get kind of the next level down, so your directors, like not the C-suite, but your kind of director levels, that's where we typically step in and say, hey, like we want you to tap into your network, but let's do a recruiting process and see who comes up, right? What's the worst thing that could happen? You end up hiring the person that you wanted to hire, but you might find somebody who's better suited for this role and ultimately creates more value. I mean, and also like I get very kind of skittish around the whole back channeling conversations, just because everybody's experience with a company is relatively unique, right? So I could be a rock star in one company and then a dud in another company, or somebody who I may not have gotten along with or gotten a job over them and would have sour grapes. Like, so I know everybody loves to do it in the VC space, and like God forbid that somebody say anything negative about somebody in the market, and then they're off the list. And I always encourage them to say, okay, that's one source of information, the back channel, it's an important one, right? But let's contextualize this. Let's talk to the person. Let's have other people on the team talk to them. Let's do a formal reference. Like, if that ultimately overrides everything else, that's fine. But let's not take that one piece of data, totally squash the candidate, and never speak of that person again. So I do like caution people of not overweighting the back channel.
That's some very good advice. I hope everybody's really listening in and taking notes on that, because I think that's what you just said is very valuable. I would like to dive into, we're talking about this faceted interview process. Can we do kind of like a slightly more tactical, actionable deep dive into that? What does that look like? What types of interviews are we talking about? What types of custom
Absolutely.
questions? Like, what can we walk through that a bit?
Yeah, so ultimately you want to have your initial phone screen. I typically want somebody else to do that rather than me. So just really kind of having that phone screen. What is your situation? What is your motivation? What are you looking to do? What's your ideal situation? What's your comp, right? And what are you capable of doing? So that kind of initial, like, is this person a potential viable candidate? And people can argue with the order on this. I've had many debates on it. I'm all about efficiency. I don't want to waste anybody's time. Other people say that you can prioritize these differently. The next interview has to be, for me, a technical interview, because I'm not going to waste people's time like interviewing a candidate that it can't actually do the job. So that would be a technical interview, whether that's development or sale, whatever it is somebody who's having a technical functional conversation with them and kind of diving deep on, okay, what did this person actually accomplish and at what scope and scale.
Does
That's
that
kind of,
also, oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, does that also include like situational questions, like saying, okay, so like if this were to happen or in this type of situation, how would you handle that? Is
Yeah,
that part of the functional interview?
I don't think technical interviews need to be that. I think you can really just dive into the projects that they've worked on,
Mhm.
because like it's very hard to really understand what somebody's done until you understand the scale and the scope and the importance of the project that they were working on. So they may be using the exact technologies that you're looking for, but if they haven't done it in the same context, right? So if you're doing AI and they're using small data sets and you're trying to categorize the entire all proteins ever used in drug manufacturing, it's a totally different scope. So you then kind of get an understanding, okay, this person has kind of similar scale and scope of experience. And then once that's been done, then you have your basically your behavioral interview. I combine the behavioral and the cultural interview. The cultural interview is basically focused on your principles, or kind of what behaviors do you expect them to display. And then you have behavioral questions associated with those particular behaviors. So if it's entrepreneurial spirit, tell me about a time that you started a new initiative internally. What were the results, or how did you go about getting it approved? What were the results? Like, and how did you measure success? Like, that would be a simple way to kind of get into it. Have they actually ever thought of an idea, translated it into execution, and then reflected on whether they did it well or not? And so you can go, pick, 4 or 5 kind of behaviors that are super important within that particular functional group in order for them to be successful. And you can reflect on that on kind of successful person and on the team. How do they operate? Like, what are they doing on a day-to-day basis that you're like, wow, I wish everybody acted that way? And that's how you can kind of quickly, unsystematically come up with the behaviors that you want to evaluate. And then you can translate those into behavioral questions, as you were referring to. And then you have your behavioral questions. I think the next step is really your case study, right? So whatever area you're in, I usually use case studies up to the manager level. So it's just like, here's a problem, think about it and come put together a deck and tell me how you would solve the problem. When we're talking about more senior folks, I call it a whiteboarding session, just so that people don't feel like they're being like interviewed like a junior resource. And that's like, for example, I'm in the process of hiring a business head for one of our businesses. And our goal is to 10x the growth of that particular business over the next 2 years. So the business case is going to be based off, you've spoken to 5 people already, you've learned everything you possibly could about the firm. Based off of everything that you've known, come in and have a conversation with us with regards to how you think you can grow the company 10x. And if you want, put a deck together. If you don't, that's fine too. And then it's me and the leadership's team responsibility to kind of provide positive reinforcement, but then also kick the tires. So saying, okay, so I understand you want to go into new markets. Why are we going into new markets? That's going to kind of distribute our resources. Why wouldn't we go deep in this particular market that we're successful? So you challenge them, which is actually kind of the most telling part of the process. And the way that they react to that challenge, and if they get defensive, right, that may not be a good cultural fit. If they buckle immediately, that might not be a cultural fit. At least for our firm currently, if you like to have healthy debate, you're a good match for us. So if you push back and say, well, Seth, the sector you're currently in is a dying sector, and you said you wanted to get to $100 million, like, you're not going to get there. And that would be somebody that I would be attracted to, because of the way that they are willing to respectfully push back on me and then tell me why I should disagree. Like, in a normal day-to-day conversation on the executive team, that would be, a 30-minute debate back and forth. But like, for somebody to be brave enough within an interview and a whiteboarding session to say, hey, Seth, I think you're wrong, which I am wrong many times, that's, to me, somebody that's a cultural fit for us. So that's why I love kind of a whiteboarding session for senior level folks. And then I think the final step is really kind of coming together in a calibration session. So just bringing everybody who met the folks, the finalist candidates, and then just talk about why you like them or why you don't, strengths and weaknesses. And then for everybody to be hyper vigilant on 2 things. Is what you're saying an assumption? Do you have evidence of this statement, or are you just assuming that this is the case? And see if anybody else has evidence of that statement. And then secondly, just kind of checking our biases, right? So just ensuring that we don't have any personal biases. So I love Michigan, so I'm obviously going to be super nice to the people who come through my organization that went to Michigan. So the guy who went to Ohio State is definitely going to disagree with me. So just being able to kind of call that out and say, hey, I know that I have a bias towards this person because he went to my school or whatever that reason is, or played lacrosse or whatever, like, and be able to say I'm biased, let me step out of it. Or for me to be able to call someone else out and says, hey, I noticed on your team that everybody that you work with, ultimately started off at Goldman, so maybe we don't need another Goldman person on the team. So that gives us an opportunity to sit around the table and kind of ensure that we're picking the right person for us.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a pretty robust process. And is that something that you're implementing with all the startups that you worked with and you're currently partnering with? Is that pretty
Yeah, I
standard
mean
across the board for different functions?
that's ultimately the roadmap, right?
Okay,
So although it sounds robust, like I've been able to make it very simple with
sure.
very simple tools and say, okay, here you go. Here's your case study. Here's your recruiting checklist. Go for it. Tell me how the calibration session goes. So once you get people kind of into these routines, I think they enjoy it. Obviously there's certain circumstances that you shortcut it, or you deviate. But if you have a process that people embrace by making it easy, it's usually not a challenge to get adoption.
Gotcha. And I know for the last topic today, just kind of going back to your intro, you're mentioning that you want to build a more inclusive world, and we talked a little bit before the show about DE&I.
Mhm.
I've always heard, and I agree with this, but from a lot of chief people officers, that the best time to get started with DE&I is now. Like, it don't, a lot of companies, I feel like they think, oh, we got to be bigger, we got to have more resources to make this a
Mhm.
priority. And it's not the case. It's actually easier to get started when you're a younger organization, when you can build the culture around that. And when you have a diverse team, they're going to refer more diverse talent as well, and so you can build a healthier culture. But the other aspect too is, when you start earlier, you can again, from the start, you can hire people that are aligned with your mission and are also prioritizing that, right?
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense to get started earlier rather than later. But walk
Yeah.
us through kind of like your philosophy on building inclusive cultures and DE&I in general.
Absolutely. I mean, this is music to my ears because I hear this from entrepreneurs all the time. Like, I can't do D&I, like I don't have the budget, I don't have a chief diversity officer. And like I always chuckle to myself, is like there's so many easy things to do that you don't need you that we could do easily very quickly together, right? So if you start from the beginning, right? So what are your values and principles? Are you calling out the fact that diversity and inclusion are important to you in your values and principles? I like to make diversity the value, right? We value diverse perspectives, period. We believe that there's no question about that. And then we expect you as an individual to act inclusively, right? So if you are not acting inclusively, then you're not aligned with our expected behaviors. And that's a way to just kind of immediately embed it into everything that you do. And then you take those and also embed them into your performance management. Right there, you've done a ton of heavy lifting, and people will be expected to behave in these ways. And then there's really simple things, right? So from your website, do you actually have diverse pictures of diverse people on your website? Do you use language that is overly kind of dramatic or overly extreme, or that would turn off female candidates, right? So there's kind of different dimensions of diversity react differently to different language. So does your website have language that is inclusive? Does your job description also use inclusive language? And do you have a diversity statement at the bottom of your job postings?
Right.
I mean, these
These
are like very simple things. This is like an hour's worth of work, right? And then I think one of the biggest things that especially the younger generation, is reacting to is if they come in and interview with all white males, for example, they'll never, a diverse candidate has that experience, they will never work for you. They will walk out of there and never consider your organization, right? Which is so important to create diverse interview panels so that they see themselves reflected, or at least for there to be kind of diversity among the people that they meet, so that they feel like they will fit in. So those are really simple things that you can do that don't require a ton of investment, don't require additional resources, and just require a little guidance. They can call me up and I'll help them through the steps, and they'll be on their way.
And from a value and principle perspective, I don't know what the current stat is. Nick, I don't know if you could actually look this up real fast, man. But like, just what percentage of Americans are employed by an SMB, small business, small to medium sized business? Because just from like a value perspective, if DE&I is important, SMBs need to take ownership of that and be part of creating that change. Because again, Nick's going to look it up right now, but a lot of Americans are employed by small to medium sized businesses.
Right.
So, if if enterprise companies are the only ones implementing DE&I practices, then a large portion of our country in society are not going to be impacted by those decisions and policies. So
absolutely, and I
it's
believe that
important.
every entrepreneur is very motivated to create a great place to work. They just may not know how. They may be a scientist, they may be a technologist, they just may have a really great idea, and they just don't understand these people practices and their impact. So when you get in front of an entrepreneur who loves their company and loves their mission, they so want to embrace these ideas. And then when you make them simple for people, then they're really happy, because they can create a better place for their employees to work. And that's what they ultimately want to do.
Gotcha. So Nick just dropped a couple of stats. So it's 47.1% of the U.S. private sector workforce works for SMBs. And according to the Small Business Administration, small companies create 1.5 million jobs annually and account for 64% of all new jobs created in the United States. So if you're a founder CEO and you care about diversity, equity, inclusion, just saying now is not the right time. If it's truly a value that we care about, then we need to take action and lead the charge. Because it's just such a huge part of our small to medium sized businesses and startups is such a huge part of our culture here in the States too, that if we're really going to make the impact we want to, it starts with small businesses, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the next generation wants to work. That's where the people are attracted to work, and they expect small businesses to have these things in place. So we just have to team up together and teach small businesses on how to do this.
Right. I love it. I love it. I love your perspective. I love your energy, what you're doing. I think it's really important. And I'm really excited to see your company grow. And I think you will to next. So you got to keep me posted with how you all are doing. And I'll try to make as many introductions as I can. And we are coming up on time here. So I did want to just say, thank you for joining us today. And if you're up for it, we'd love to have you on for a round 2 one of these days.
Absolutely. This has been such a fun conversation. It's so awesome to meet like-minded, purpose-driven entrepreneurs like yourself. And I'm happy to help out however I can. I'll have you guys come in to our DC HQ, and you can come check it out, and maybe we can do some events or do some work together.
Let's do it. Let's do it. And I actually, before we jump off, I forgot to ask if people want to follow you online, where can they find you?
It's pretty easy to find me. So LinkedIn, I'm probably one of the most networked LinkedIn persons. So it's Seth Pablo Welty on LinkedIn. I'm also a bit of a YouTuber. So if you want to see my journeys around the world as a digital nomad, you can find me at Ciao My Friend on YouTube. That's also my Instagram handle as well. you can always search for me on YouTube as well under Seth Welty. So I'm pretty visible. It's hard to avoid me at these days.
I love it. And we should do a show at some point about you being a digital nomad. That sounds awesome. I actually, in the founding days of Secure Vision, lived in about 10 different countries, just traveling around, working remotely. And so I think that would be a lot of fun at some
Yes.
point. We don't have time today, but some point soon we should talk about that.
Yes, next time, because we seem to have a lot of commonalities, and I think we should continue the conversation.
For sure, for sure. And for everybody else tuning in, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.